All right, everybody, good morning. Welcome back. Hope you guys had a good weekend. We still got like 4 minutes until class time, so I guess just for now, get comfortable. And as usual, we'll be ready to go at 9 a.m. Happy, what is it, President's Day? Even though it's not a holiday for us, I guess. President's Day or George Washington's birthday? I heard there's a little bit of debate about that. Welcome back. Good morning, everyone. Hey, Connor, what's up? Hi, Steven. Good morning. Hey, Dimitri. Hi, Ryan. Good to see everybody. You're having a good day so far, kind of early. Hey, Sloan. Hi, Grant. Cool. Thanks for being here again. Just a couple minutes. Hey there, Alex. Morning. Hi, Kylie. Got the early crew here, I guess. Welcome back. Just another minute. Hello, hello. Hi, everybody. Abby, Elif, Nicole, Ellie, and Claire. Hey, Julia. Good morning. Some people's favorite time of day. You guys are up before everybody else. You did like 2 hardcore philosophy lessons while everyone's still asleep. So, I mean, that's something to celebrate, right? Hey, Brian, Claire, Julia, good to see everybody. Okay, just a few seconds. Hello, hello. Hi, Mervin, Patrick. Okay, guys, so it's pretty much 9 a.m. I'm going to let us get started then. Welcome back. Hi, Ryan. Good to see you too. So let me just get started with a quick question. Maybe someone can confirm. Did anybody notice the Canvas message that I sent out, the little announcement with the essay prompts last night? Let me know in the chat if you received your notice of that. Okay, very good. Thanks, Ryan. So that's one thing I want to start off the meeting, just talking about the upcoming essay, the first essay, and we'll talk about the prompts a little bit. Everybody that's here, if you didn't yet get a chance to tap into the chat just to sort of record your attendance, make sure you do that. And yeah, so let me proceed to some quick discussion of the prompts. So I'm looking at it right now, and I'm just going to go over all the major important points that I see here in the text of the essay prompts. So first of all, there's 2 options. You could write on either of the 2 topics, but you cannot write on both. So you have to choose one, just write on and report on the one that you prefer. So it kind of just depends on what you feel like you'll have a better time reporting on, what you understand a little more, or what you find more interesting. So you basically, these 2 essays give you a choice to compare and contrast two different arguments for God's existence and the objections to them. So you could choose to do either the combo of ontological argument and Pascal's wager. Today, we're going to talk about the Pascal's wager, so a little details to follow in today's lecture, but that's one of your options. And the other one is if you wanted to instead report on the cosmological argument and the argument from design, which we've gone over so far. And then let me just read the full document. It starts and it says, you must write a 3 to 4 page essay, double-spaced. Ooh, little typo, I hate that. So sorry for my grammatical incoherence there. What it should say is you must write a 3 to 4 page double-spaced essay. I just had the word essay duplicated. Oops. You must write a 3 to 4 page double-spaced essay on one of the topics below in 12-point font with normal margins. And notice one other thing, that I adjusted the due date by just 2 days. So instead of it being Monday the March 1st, 2 weeks from today, it's Wednesday, March 3rd. So that's 16 days from now. You've got that much time to work on and compile and just finish up your essay. Furthermore, it says you may not consult any electronic resources whatsoever, and there's no permission for you to use the internet when you write this essay. What you're permitted to do is just use your textbook, the notes, and your own common sense, and that's it. There's no additional resources that you're allowed. So you may not go on the internet and find any comments, reporting, analysis at all of any of these arguments. So, of course, there's a lot of wealth of information on all of these interesting arguments that have been discussed for thousands of years online. But I'm only interested in what you, the one person who you are, has to say about them, together with the knowledge that you've derived from your book, the lectures, and your notes. So just understand that that wouldn't be tolerated. I know that you guys are trustworthy and honest, and it's a campus that usually, I think, holds up those standards. So I don't have a lot of issues really with plagiarism at Chapman, but sometimes it happens. It's not a good thing, and it puts everyone in an awkward position. So I don't want to put you or me there in that kind of situation. So let's just make sure to play by the rules, and you may not use the internet. If you were to write this paper on a typewriter, that would be awesome. But nowadays we don't have those. So I guess you're just going to use this computer as a glorified electronic typewriter, and it doesn't even have a web browsing function. Just pretend you're writing this in the 1950s, when the whole concept of computing was just a totally alien idea. This is old school, we're using books. So anyway, just making that clear. I always have to sort of emphasize it because I want to make sure everyone knew that I had a policy. Anyway, though, so the other thing is the essay is worth 15% of your total grade. Let me go into a little bit more discussion of the format. I always get these questions from students. Is this MLA? Is this APA? Da, 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 da. I don't really know much about those pieces of terminology. I'm a published writer, but I just think that it's best to keep it simple, guys. So look, just focus on those basic, simple things there. 12-point font, so that means you cannot use a larger font or a smaller font. Sometimes students deviate from that one way or the other. Sometimes they want bigger letters so that they can write less content and still meet the page length guideline. But that's not going to work because I know what 12-point font is. So just don't change the font. It has to be 12. The other thing is it's double-spaced, so not single-spaced. Then you'd be writing twice as much. And you also can't expand the spacing by more than double-spaced. There's all kind of little things that some students, and it really just shows a lack of confidence in their written work, but sometimes students are just anxious about meeting the page length guideline as if that's what the professor's mostly looking at. Well, it's the content that matters the most. But you don't want to play any games trying to get to the finish line, like by making big letters, giant spacing, or expanding the margins so much that there's a tiny piece of text in the center of the page. So your default margins on your word processor, 12-point font, and double-spaced. It says 3 to 4 page. That's the page length guideline. Let me say this. I don't mind much if you exceed the upper boundary. So if you feel like you reached 3 or 4 pages and you have more to say, it's okay to just continue to spill over into 5th, 6th page, right? I think much more than that, though, you probably want to start wrapping up because then it's getting closer to a term paper type of length. And this is intended more as just a sort of short, focused essay on these prompts. So anyway, 3 to 4 pages, but if you need a little more space than 4, that's okay. On the lower boundary, though, you should not try to go and dip below the lower boundary because then it's just not going to have enough information or detail. So I would say, as you're writing the paper, think of a 3 to 4 pages. The upper boundary is soft and the lower boundary is a little harder. Okay, and then let's see, you're going to submit it to me. Just do an email submission. So you're just going to send it to vulich@chapman.edu with an attached document, and that'll be your essay submission. This is a ways out. It's obviously over 2 weeks away. But when you do send it to me, I'll give you a confirmation email back just to let you know that I got it. Word file is usually the best, but anything as long as I can open it, if it's a PDF or a Google Doc, even Pages, I guess some people like to use. I can open all those, but just make sure there's no restrictions on it that I have to like request permission to open it or something like that. I don't think that would be a problem. About style, let me give you some points on style, because a lot of times when you've written essays so far throughout college and through your schooling, you've been writing them in like English classes where they really emphasize the format of the classic English essay, you know, strong introduction with a thesis statement, and then body paragraphs, and then a conclusion where you summarize it all. Okay, well, the way that I think, especially in a philosophy class, we're more concerned with the content of the body paragraphs. So I would say to you this: you should kind of cut short or even cut out altogether a long-winded intro paragraph where you kind of tie this theme of the paper together with like all of human history and like all of that, you know. So if you said, you know, God and man, it's one of the most ancient and vexing topics, and great minds have grappled with this for millennia, and here we are, and it's 2021, and we all have our own thoughts. Like, by the way, we're now like 2/3 of the way down the first page, and you still haven't really started analyzing the author. So to me, you can just kind of cut the formalities and get straight into the analysis of the argument. I mean, a person's first sentence could even be, St. Anselm wrote the Ontological Argument in 1078, trying to prove that God exists, and here is how the argument develops. And then you just start telling me about the content of the argument. So you're not going to impress the grader, the professor, me, with your command of the English vocabulary and diction, your sweeping poetic prose. Really, the genre of writing, especially in modern day philosophy, it's less like the English novelist, and it's more like the hardcore, like legal thinker, like a lawyer. So you're kind of like presenting these arguments as though they were legal briefs, as it were, towards the case for the God's existence or non-existence. So think of it in those terms. The aesthetic you're trying to go for is like cold, clinical, factual, legalistic, not open, sweeping, poetic, gestural, you know, figurative. It's not like that. So the analysis is everything, and you want to be detailed. And so that's good. Now, if you quote the text, and you should, I think, at times include some quotes from the book just as added support for what you're analyzing and reporting on. When you include quotes, here's all that you have to do. Enclose the quotes inside of quotation marks, right? So whatever, if you have a direct quote or passage from the book, put it in your essay in quotation marks, and then at the end of the quoted passage, just put the page number you found it on in parentheses. Okay, so there's only one source that you're really allowed, which is the textbook. So I'll know that when you quote it and put the page number, that it refers to the book page number from our book. You don't need to have a separate works cited or bibliography. If this is a research paper where you're like going out and finding like 3 or 4 different sources, then the professor wants to see, you know, what were the books that you used or the articles, whatever. But it would be, I think, a little bit unnecessary, right, for you to tell me, hey, here's a textbook of our class, and that's on the bibliography page, because we all have the same textbook. So it's okay for you to just use the parenthetical page citation convention that I just described in lieu of a more, you know, fulsome, separate bibliography or works cited. Okay, so those are I'm just starting now with some basics. The format guidelines, the style guidelines, conventions for citation, and then now let me read the prompts themselves. So there's these 2. First one says, discuss the ontological argument in Pascal's wager and provide 2 objections to each. So first of all, let me speak on that. You have to, first of all, completely review and discuss the arguments to the reader. You have to explain their major claims and how they get to the conclusion that God exists. So think of it as though you're trying to explain these arguments to a very, you know, an intelligent but unschooled high school sophomore or something. Like if you had like a little brother or someone who was still a few years behind you, not yet in college, and they said, what is the ontological argument? That's a big word. Tell me how you would explain it to that person in a straightforward, direct way, which captures the force of the argument and everything that it says, but says it accurately. So you're going to discuss the two arguments. Today we'll talk about Pascal's wager, so you know that's something that I'll mention today. And you also have to state two objections to each. So I'm thinking of the objections that we've all studied, that we will study in our book. With the ontological argument, there was Gamillo, G.E. Moore, and William Rowe. So you can use any of their different objections and report on them as the two. So there's a total of 4 objections. 2 objections to the ontological, 2 objections to Pascal's wager. So that'll take up like the bulk of your paper, just analyzing the ontological argument, providing 2 objections. Analyzing Pascal's wager, providing 2 objections. And then when you're done with that, the last part of the essay is kind of your response, where you, the student, tell me, in your judgment, which of the 2 arguments was better, if either. So like I'm asking, did you think the ontological argument was the better argument, the more persuasive argument, or was it the Pascal's wager that was the more convincing and persuasive, plausible argument? You're going to tell me which one you thought was better than the other, if you do, and then tell me why. And when you give the reason why, you have to give, like, you know, a philosophical kind of reason why. You can't just say something arbitrary like, well, I like Anselm's name better than Pascal. Pascal, just his name, Blaise. How weird is that? So I prefer St. Anselm's argument. That would be just irrelevant. So it has to be reasons given as to why it was the better argument and why it was more persuasive to you. Now, here's the other thing. Some students won't have any reaction to the arguments that one is better than the other. Some students will think, I don't know, I didn't really think either one was better. If so, that's okay as well, but you also have to defend that response. So if you thought neither one was better than the other, then tell me why you did not think that one won the day over the other one, or why they're equally flawed or equally strong, if that's the case. Okay, and then that'll kind of wrap your essay up. So that'll certainly be enough for a 3 to 4 page space. And anybody who's working on their papers, as you get a little further into the writing, if you need any help or you'd like to show me a draft or something, I'm always happy to kind of take a look at them, as long as they come in not too late in the game before it's due. And I could give you some comments back, but you'll be able to ask me if you like through email, and we can always have that exchange. So that's prompt 1, ontological versus Pascal. Prompt 2 below says, discuss the cosmological argument and the argument from design and provide 2 objections to each of them. So, you know, we've studied cosmological argument, the one about what's the cause of the universe, has to be a necessary being. Argument from design, if you found a watch, it had a maker because it's too sophisticated and complex and hasn't functioned. So what about like the eye that has also got that kind of sophistication, so it had to have a creator? And then you'd give 2 objections to each. The objections for those 2 are most going to be found in the writing of Ernest Nagel in this article, Does God Exist?, that we've pretty much now finished. Just one more thing I'm going to say about it as I conclude this primer on the essay prompts. And then again, so it's the same essay with just different options. And so the wording of the prompt is the same. Is one of these arguments better than the other? If so, tell me which one you think it is and why. And if not, why not? So as I said, you can have a kind of short and to the point, or even just eliminate the classical intro. No need for a big thesis statement. You're just going to kind of attack the prompt directly, starting on the first beginning of your paper. And then with the conclusion at the end, I also don't think it's necessary to have like a big kind of wordy, here's what I just said and here's why I said it. Just if you answer all the questions in the prompt, then you'd be free to just close as soon as you're done discussing the last question of the prompt. Okay, now Stephen, are we supposed to write our opinion on which it is better in the first person? Okay, yeah, I always get this question, and it's fine to use first person in philosophy. It's a common thing, so there's no rules like what you learned before. Like, don't use the impersonal third person tense. One thinks, one says this. Just say I think it, and that's fine, okay? And then you also say what counts as evidence as to why one is more convincing. I don't know, Stephen. Wow, it's philosophical. You're the judge. You're going to tell me what evidence is that it's more convincing. They're reasons. They're just rational arguments. So is it compelling to you? If it is, then you'll say, well, here's the reason that it was, because I think an argument based on a definition has a greater ability to persuade than an argument that is based on fear of going to hell. You know, you got reasons. I don't know what your reasons are. You're the individual, but you'll cite your reaction to the arguments. You ever see these reaction videos? Someone's like, I like this song. No, I don't like that song. What are their reasons? I don't know. I can't develop the criteria, but people can make good arguments. So what counts as evidence as to why one is more convincing? The mere fact that you were more convinced by it, backed by your explanation as to why. Okay? So that's about all I can say on that. And I think, let me hear other questions. Anyone else has questions on this? We can always come back to it too as we continue to move through the next few weeks. Not to worry, good question, Stephen. But that's the first kind of opening statement and just back and forth about the essay topic. So that's your first essay, your first assignment. It's about 2 weeks and 2 days away when you're going to turn it in. After we're done with that, we'll be looking at towards the midterm, but we got a few weeks in between the first essay and the midterm as well. Okay, guys, so if that's all well and good, then let me just go back into our meeting for today. So we had already finished everything from Ernest Nagel except for one last piece at the end of his paper. So let me kind of remind you where we were on Friday. Ernest Nagel's article, Does God Exist? So he is an author that criticizes all of these major arguments that we studied. So he tries to knock them all down with his, logical objections to the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, argument from design. And then as we finished the meeting last time, we were just discussing these two other sort of, I call the miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. One of them, the argument from the unfairness of the world without God, and then the other one, the argument from religious experience. So the last thing that's in Nagel's paper at the close is that he presents a different argument, an argument that God does not exist. So to this point in the class, in the semester, we've only really studied arguments to attempt to prove that God exists, together with objections of those arguments. We've not yet, until now, looked at an argument on the other side, which is trying to make the case that there's actually no God. And so here we will at least study one of them. So this is the last note from the Ernest Nagel paper. And the argument that we're talking about is called the problem of evil. Say hi to Peachy. She's a good girl. Okay, so problem of evil. This argument has been used to try and make the case that there's no God for 1,000 years at least. There's a lot of discussion of it in medieval Christian theology because it was considered a real thorn in the side of the church. It's one of those arguments that has had, I think, some success actually in persuading people that there's no God. But here's the nature of the argument. So in logic and philosophy, when you write out an argument in standard form, what they call standard form, you usually have it set out as follows on the page. You have a conclusion at the bottom, and then you have what are called the premises listed above. The premises are the reasons, the evidence that supports the conclusion at the bottom. So in this argument, we got two premises which lead to the conclusion. The first premise says this: if God did exist, then there would be no evil in the world. Okay, that's the first premise, first, claim or whatever in the argument. If God existed, then there would be no evil in the world. The second premise merely says that after that, but there is evil in the world. Okay, if God existed, then there wouldn't be any evil in the world, but, second premise, but there is evil in the world. So, maybe you could deduce the conclusion from the two premises, but it's pretty elementary. The conclusion from the argument would just be that God does not exist. Okay, so now let me ask you guys in the chat so we can discuss this just a little bit. What do you think about the first premise? Let's go through it line by line. What is the reason you think that someone would make this claim that if God existed, there would not be evil in the world? What is it about the concept of God that some anyway think would rule out the possibility of evil? Are these Nagel's beliefs? Ryan, Nagel's an atheist, but this argument is thousands of years old. So, it's many people's beliefs. Nagel is just one commenter. Like if you report on the Constitution today in the year 2021 and you say, here's the First Amendment, and someone says, is that your belief? You're reporting on the document. This is an argument. He's reporting on it, but he does agree with it, yes. Okay, so Ellie, God is supposed to be all good. Yes, that's one of the points. Omnibenevolent, all benevolent. But there's one more thing too. Grant, I think you're kind of hinting at it where you say he created everything. So true, omnibenevolence is one of the features that's implied by this claim. But there's one of the other ones, classical attributes of God. They say he's perfectly good, but you could be perfectly good and not be able to do anything about the evil. So it's not just that he's all good. What's the other one you think I'm hinting at? All good is half of it. But the other aspect is that he's also, yes, correct, Brian, thought to be all-powerful. And yeah, Amanda, you've also now mentioned it. So omnipotent and omnibenevolent. Those two things, according to the logic of the argument anyway, is that according to those things, evil couldn't exist because, like, think of it. If there's a being that's perfectly good, infinitely good, then evil is the opposite of good. So he wouldn't like for there to be evil. And if he's got all power, then he's got infinite power. So he could cancel or end anything evil happening just through his will, through his wish, through his power. So if God would have both the means and the motive to eliminate evil, then there shouldn't be any. But of course, there is evil in the world. That's the second premise. What is that? Well, I mean, we could go down the list, but there's all kinds of terrible things happening all the time. People just getting shot for doing nothing, little kids getting murdered, there's rape happening, so there's torture out there. So terrible things happen, you know, and therefore the argument says there must not be a God, because if there was, there wouldn't be all that evil. Nonetheless, there actually is. So that must mean that we don't have a God that's this all-powerful, perfectly good being running the show, ruling the universe. Stephen, you say evil is subjective. So good. I can see that you're already like thinking about what could be the criticisms of this argument. And as with all the arguments that we studied, there's always objections. So in the same way as we've looked at objections to the very powerful theist arguments, there are definitely objections to this one too. And Stephen, you're kind of mentioning one of those. So let me go into discussion of that. To those that reject the argument here, you know, a believer in God is not going to agree with the conclusion. So the main way to dispute it would be to say that, well, in premise 2, it claims there's evil in the world. But is there, though? Like, maybe one argument could be that what appears to be evil to you is actually all for the best. If you could take a step back and see it from, like, God's point of view or whatever, then you would see that the difficulties and struggles, etc., that people go through are somehow vindicated or justified in the big picture. So maybe another way of resisting the argument would be to say that God gave us free will, and what you think of as evil is the result of human beings making like bad or immoral decisions, but it's better for us to have free will than not to have it. So there's a couple of ways of rejecting the argument. Maybe you could claim that evil is really just a mere illusion. In fact, everything's for the best because God would never do anything less than perfect. Or you could say that he allows for the existence of free will, which is actually for the good, but sometimes it results in bad behavior. I don't know. Nagel has considered these objections, and I'll just tell you, speaking in his voice, here's, I think, his response. He says that even if what you're saying evil is just an illusion, you cannot deny that at least it looks like evil, apparently. You know, if someone's suffering, being tortured, hurt, harmed in a way that's unjustified, then he thinks, isn't that still bad enough, even if you just call it an illusion? Like, even apparent evil is worse than the alternative, which is to have a universe in which nothing like that even appears to happen. And if you think that it's an inevitable result of human beings having free will that we would commit evil actions, or even just apparently evil actions, there's also a couple of issues with that. First of all, not everything that's happening to humans that is bad or whatever is due to a free choice. Like, sometimes it's just a natural disaster, like a lightning bolt just hits somebody and kills them. You know, you can't really say that was the person that made an evil choice. And another thing is this. So we said it would be cold comfort to a person suffering through what we call like a perceived or apparent evil. He also says this very interesting point. So when you claim that, oh, evil's an illusion and it's all for the best, if you could see it from the big picture, he says, well, why is it that we harbor this assumption instead of the opposite? Isn't the opposite just as well likely to say that whatever you think of as good and righteous and just is just an illusion and it's all for the worst, and the universe is overseen by like the worst conceivable being? In that case, it seems only like a projection of human hopes and aspirations to say that everything that appears evil is really for the best. Because given the state of our evidence, you don't have any really better reason to believe that than the more cynical or pessimistic view, that it's all for the worst. And, you know, loving acts of kindness and charity are just illusions to set you up for a bigger fall. So in his mind, it's not the most powerful argument to reject the problem of evil. So he kind of rests his case there. Isn't God supposed to be all forgiving as well? Yes, true, Noah. But I guess that's one point about the omnibenevolence aspect. You know, perfectly good involves being forgiving and moral and kind. So that's the force of the first premise. People think that in case God's perfectly good and powerful, he wouldn't allow evil to exist, and yet it does. I thought of this too. When people say free will gives us license to commit evil acts, I've always been a little bit confused about that point, because I kind of know what people mean. Like, if I'm given free will, then, you know, free will means I can choose to do things that I should not do. But just because you have the freedom to do them in theory doesn't mean that you actually have to do them. Like, any number of us has the freedom to do something really terrible today, like if we really, really wanted to. But of course, we wouldn't do it. I would hope we wouldn't do it. So couldn't we still have free will if we just had the mere concept of bad behavior in our mind, but we never actually acted that way? You know, like, I mean, you know, you could, like, in theory, kill people, but you would never do it. And so you have free will, but that doesn't mean you have to actually use it to do something bad. I can imagine a universe where everyone is tempted by the possibility of bad behavior, but they never really do it. They watch movies and read novels where fictional characters do it, and they just kind of like think about, oh God, that would be a horrible thing. You know, so not everything we have the freedom to do is something that we actually have to do. So I don't necessarily know how I can see that there's a direct connection between it being possible for people to do evil actions and then some kind of like inevitable result they actually would. But I digress. Okay, so we're moving on now from the Ernest Nagel. Just wanted to add the problem of evil argument to our discussions and to our notes, because it is mentioned in his in the end of his essay. Okay, guys, so for anybody that was thinking or looking at the first essay prompt, which is Ontological Argument versus Pascal's Wager, this is going to be an important part of the notes for that option, because this is now going to be discussion of Pascal's Wager, the other argument in prompt 1. Okay, so we're moving to a new author, and we're still on the philosophy of religion for pretty much this is going to be our last week of discussing philosophy of religion material. Here's the new author for us. His name is Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal. So interesting name. He's a French philosopher of the 17th century. So he lived from 1623 until 1662. And so he had a short, but it was a very impressive, impactful life. He was a mathematician, a scientist, and a theologian and philosopher of religion. So he had an interesting mix of intellectual abilities. And he wrote a book which was only published later after he died, and it's called, so from 1669, posthumously published, called Pensées. Not that it's pen, sorry. Pensées. And that just means in French, thoughts. So his book, Pensées, Pascal published this, or it was published, in, you know, collections of his notes were found and retrieved after he died. 1669, the book Thoughts. Within that book, we encounter this argument. Oh, Stephen, you're saying we didn't get to the religious experience argument? Okay. Let me just make short work of that, if that's true. Is that the case, though, guys? Did I not get to speak about it? I thought I had mentioned it, but maybe I didn't quite finish the full review. Can anybody back Stephen up on that? If so, it's not a big deal. I'll just quickly note a few things about that argument. Let me hear in the chat. Very briefly, Ryan says. Okay, well, here's just a very quick rundown of it. It doesn't take a lot of time to mention. Nagel's response to it. Well, Nagel is kind of, okay, yeah, so his criticism of it. Problem with that argument. Another argument, one of the two miscellaneous arguments for God's existence, is the argument from religious experience. That one says that sometimes people have these powerful moments in life that they think revealed that God exists. So a person was praying, meditating, survived a near-death encounter, witnessed something they thought was kind of miraculous or just awe-inspiring, and somehow from that moment they said, I had a powerful religious experience, now I know there's a God. And they use that experience as their evidence to others that God exists. he says there's two big problems with this way of arguing for God. Number one, the evidence that you have is an experience that you had in your past. And the problem with that kind of evidence, he says, is that it cannot be shared. It's private to you. So with other evidence, with good evidence, usually you can make it available for another person to inspect. So if I said, hey, Jones killed somebody, and you're like, how do you know that? I could bring in an evidence exhibit, and I could say, well, here, look at a photograph of a footprint found on the crime scene, which matches a shoe that Mr. Jones was known to own. There you see it. You see the evidence. Examine it yourself, and you come to my conclusion. With this religious experience thing, I can't say to another person, here, you want to look at it? Here's my experience. Just check it for yourself, and you'll see the same thing I saw. So that's one of the issues. You cannot convey the experience to another person if they haven't had it themselves. And then the other thing is, he says this, there's also a different way to explain the occurrence of the claimed experience that makes no mention of anything supernatural or religious. So you know what I'm talking about. Someone could say, oh, you thought you had a religious experience? Okay, well, you were high on drugs, or you were really sleep deprived, or you're going through a psychotic episode or an emotional breakdown, or maybe, you know, your brain was misfiring because you were oxygen deprived, or maybe because you were suffering trauma from blood loss, you know. So there's always going to be this kind of psychological or non-supernatural alternative explanation for the claimed religious experience. And so for a skeptic anyway, they're going to probably assign it that kind of explanation rather than the supernatural one. So those are the two main issues. Let me just repeat them. Number one, the experiences cannot be verified by other people because they're private to the one who had them. And then number two, to a skeptic, the claim of the experience will always be analyzed as having a naturalistic explanation, okay? So think about what an argument is for. An argument is given to convince somebody who's not already on your side, who's not already convinced by your claims, right? Why would you make an argument to someone who already believes the same thing that you do? You know, like go up to someone and tell them, hey, yo, the earth is round. They'll be like, yes, I agree. So if you're coming to another religious person and you're a theist and you said, hey, I had a religious experience, so that's how I know God exists. That person is probably just going to shrug and be like, okay, sure. So I had the same kind of experience. High five, we both believe in God. But if the other person does not believe in God, that's the only kind of person who you would really make the case to. And to that person, they haven't had a religious experience, evidently, since they don't believe. And they're going to be a little skeptical of your claims. So he thinks this is not the most persuasive argument because it lacks power to compel a skeptic. Okay, so thanks, guys, for reminding me. I didn't want to move on too quickly. That's just some commentary and discussion of the argument from religious experience, okay? But now let's go ahead. Let's talk about this Blaise Pascal guy. So from his book, Pensées, 1669, we've found this argument called the wager. And so that becomes our goal right now, to like dive into and learn about the wager. In the centuries ever since this was written, okay, Grant, you're telling me about the argument from unfairness? We didn't cover that. Okay. I thought that we had at least a little bit of time to cover it. Tell me, what is the argument from unfairness? Any kind of, I just want to know where your knowledge is on that argument, what I did or didn't cover. Yeah, if God does not exist, the world would be too unfair, so God must exist. Yeah, no, we did cover it, Grant. We talked about it completely because other students are telling me what the commentary was and what the criticism was. The criticism was that it's based on the assumption that the universe is fair, but absent that assumption, the argument loses all force, and most people don't think that the world is fair. That was it. That was all, Grant. There's no more. I don't know what else I could say about it. Some people think that if God did not exist, then when bad things happen to good people in life, they would just go to their grave and never be rewarded. And when good things happen to bad people in life, then they would just go to their grave with no punishment. And so he says, you know, some people think that if God's sort of there to balance the scales of justice in the afterlife, he'll give people their just deserts. Those that deserve a reward will get it, even if they didn't get it in life. Those that deserve a punishment will get it, or they'll at least be deprived of a reward, even if they never faced accountability in life. But he says, in the end, how is this a convincing argument? Most people don't think the world is fair, and that is the only assumption that's standing the argument up. But no, it's a good thing. I want to make sure that everyone's clear, so thanks, Grant. You know, normally I would review the things that I talked about before at the beginning of the meeting, so that would have clarified all of this, but today I wanted to start the meeting with a discussion of the prompts. So perhaps my organization on that might have lost some of the notes or memories from Friday, but anyway, I think we're all good now. So if, with your permission, please, let me talk about Pascal's wager. So Pascal's wager, aka the wager. It's now known more as Pascal's wager because this has become a very famous and prominent argument, but in his own writing, he doesn't have that kind of arrogance to say Pascal's wager. So he just calls it the wager. Not to worry. Thank you guys for asking me to review. I always want to make sure that we're clear, so I'm happy to do that. But I do want to talk about this wager now. Okay, so the first thing he says is he's got a bit of a different approach from some of our other authors on the same question. As you've seen, the other authors, with the exception of Nagel, of course, and the critics of Anselm, they've all tried to directly make the case that God exists, right? They tried to say, here's a way to prove that he's real. And with Pascal, in the very beginning, he comes right out and he says, I'm taking a different approach because I don't think that I can prove that God exists. He says, you know what? In fact, it would be foolish to even attempt to do that. He says, God, if he exists, is so far over our head because he'd be an infinite being, way beyond the limitations of a human mind to comprehend. So he says, in case God exists, he would be so far beyond our powers of understanding that we would never be able to prove it or disprove it. So he says, I'm not going to play that game. I'm not going to attempt to prove that God exists because he says, really, it just can't be done. And he also kind of, what's the term, throws shade or whatever at the people that criticize believers in God for not having better arguments. Because he says, in a way, it's almost like a sign of respect for God that you're not trying to assemble some clever argument. It's almost like you realize that he can't be proven in that way, and it's a sign of respect for him that you just believe in him without having to necessarily have an argument. But he says, here's one thing that we know for sure. We can't prove whether he does or doesn't, but we know that he either what or what. Let me see. Can anyone perhaps complete that sentence? We know for a fact that either it is the case that God blank or blank. We don't know which one, but we know that it has to be one of these two possible facts. So what do you think is this either or statement that I'm gesturing towards? We don't know specifically that he exists or that he doesn't, but we do know for a fact that either or, Stephen, you have to say two things. Two disjuncts are in every disjunction. Like I'll either eat pizza or tacos. So you have to give me the two, this or that. He either must blank or blank. So you've not given enough information just yet. But that's part of it, okay, Stephen? It's a big hint. So try again, maybe. We know for a fact, just think of it logically, that he either exists or doesn't exist. Correct, yes. So here's his first big opening statement. Nobody can prove that God exists or does not exist. Nobody can prove whether God exists or not, but, second point, but we know for sure that either God exists or he does not exist. Okay, so look at that statement there. Either God exists or does not exist. In grammar and in logic, there's a word for that type of sentence, and it's called a disjunction. A disjunction is just an either-or sentence. And in this disjunction, it mentions that one of these two things is the case. Either God exists or doesn't. And in any disjunction where you disjoin a statement to its negation, that overall disjunction is necessarily true. It's a necessary truth. So like, suppose I tell you I can't prove right now sitting here in this chair whether aliens exist somewhere in the universe outside of planet Earth or not. But I know for a fact that they either do or don't. It cannot be that they both do and don't. That's incoherent. So one of those two things is a fact right now. I don't know which one it is, but if there's life forms outside this planet, then they do. And if there's no such things, then they don't. It's got to be one of the two cases. It cannot be both. And so the same is true of God. He either exists in reality or there's no such thing as God in reality. So he says, knowing that it's one or the other and we can't prove which one, we're kind of forced to make a wager, he claims. it's kind of like comparable to an actual wager on a coin flip. And let me explain his parallelism here between the wager on whether God exists and the actual wager of a normal coin flip. Okay, so when you have a coin, and you flip it, one thing that you know is that it's got to be, in the end, either heads or tails, which face lands. It's going to be one or the other, but of course you don't know in advance of flipping it which one it will be. That's the reason you do the flip and why it's a random outcome. It's a 50-50 pretty much, but we don't know until the coin lands. So he says that's similar to the situation here with God. Right now you have no knowledge, and there's none that you could have, as to whether he really exists or not. But like the coin flip, one of those two sides of the coin is true. Either it's true that he does or he doesn't. And you're now being called on to take a wager as to which one. So let me break down for you a little bit the dynamics of an actual wager on a real coin flip. And then we'll come back to his larger discussion about God and the existence of God. So this box that I'm going to draw, which you can, I guess, put in your notes, this is going to stand for what we sometimes call it in game theory, a Punnett Square. We generate these squares to game out possible outcomes and combinations of choice and result. So in this little Punnett Square, on the top two vertical columns, I'm going to put headers that stand for the results of a coin flip. So one of the results could be that the coin will land heads. And a different, the other result of the same coin flip could be that the coin lands tails. Okay, now, over here in the two left horizontal rows, we're going to place the two possible betting stances that a bettor can take when they engage in this wager of the coin flip. So who can tell me in the chat, what is one choice that the individual can make with respect to the coin flip wager? A person can tell me one of the options. You can call or pick blank. Let's see. Easy enough. This is, yes, correct, Ryan. So you could call heads. Should have a little bit of a better marker. Calling heads, that's one of your obvious choices. You have two of them, you can call heads, versus the other choice, which is clearly that you could call tails. Now notice that in each box on the grid here, we connect a betting stance with an outcome of the coin flip. And in the box, we will show the result if those two factors were aligned. So suppose that one calls heads and heads landed. I'll write a W or an L in here to designate whether that would be a winning bet or a losing bet. And you can help me with this. So top left box, box 1 we will call it. Box 1, is that a W or an L? Where you call heads and heads lands. If you're reading the graph correctly, it should be very easy to know whether that's a win or a loss. So just ask me for box 1, it is a W. Called heads, heads landed, you won your wager. Okay, and then we're just going to go through all the three other boxes. Box 2, person calls heads, but tails shows out. Nice, Eric. Yeah, well, in this case, that's an L, right? You called heads, tails was with the outcome, so you lost the wager. In another case, you called tails, and heads is the face that shows. That's another loss. And then one more possibility, you calling tails, and tails lands, and that's a win. So with a coin flip, there's two ways to win and two ways to lose. You can win by either choosing heads when heads lands or tails when tails lands, or you can lose by calling heads when it's tails that shows or calling tails when it is heads that shows. So now we're going to graft this kind of little model onto the larger question that he's got here. How shall you wager on the question of God's existence? Because it's the same features hold, he thinks. You're put in a position where there's two sides of a so-called coin, and you don't know which one it will be. It will either be that God exists or he doesn't, and all you're forced to do is take a pick, which is going to be which choice will you make. And he says when you're making wagers like this, or any wager, the best bet for you is the one that exposes you to the least risk of loss and gives you the greatest potential for benefit or for gain. So why would you take a riskier bet if another bet is less risky and holds out a greater potential to benefit and to promote your own self-interest? So now we're going to switch the actual parameters of the wager up to reflect the question that we're really interested in here, which is whether we should believe in God or not, according to the author Pascal. So, okay, up here, let's show the two possible outcomes of the big wager of God's existence. One could be, now we're not talking about landing heads, but rather that God exists. So that's one possible outcome of the so-called wager. It could be that in the end, despite the fact that we can't prove it or anything, that God actually does exist. God exists. Or the other possibility, since he says we don't really know, it could be that God does not exist. Now over here are the two betting choices for the individual that's wagering, me or you. So one of the choices that any of us can make is to choose to believe in God. So that's to believe in God, believe God exists. Versus the other alternative, which is do not believe that God exists. Okay, so as before, we fill in the boxes here by assigning the outcome to the individual in case this combination of betting stance and result were to occur. So suppose that a person believes in God and they were correct. God did exist. So this is a win or a loss? Well, the way of filling in the boxes will mirror the previous example. So that's a win. I hope you can see, right? That's choosing to have believed and you were right. And that turned out to be the actual case. So if you believe in God and God does exist, it's a win, I guess. What would be the win? What would be the jackpot or the payout to the individual if they bet that way and they ended up getting it right? Who can tell me in the chat if they have a thought or some kind of background knowledge as to what is commonly considered to be the big benefit in winning in this case? When you believe in God and there is a God, what is won, if anything? Let me see, say in the chat. Because this is going to really, okay, heaven, salvation, right. Heaven is in basic terms. And the heavenly afterlife. And how good is that supposed to be? Well, I mean, according to Stephen, no, it's not about the reassurance, because you never get reassurance. I mean, according to what he has said, nobody will ever know whether God exists or not. But when you die, I mean, if he exists and you believed in him, then you're going to be rewarded with the heavenly afterlife. And how good is heaven? It's supposed to be paradise, right? It's supposed to be the best thing possible, better than anything else, infinite, eternal, happy life. So that's like positive to the infinity. That's the win of all wins, right? But we have 3 more boxes. So we have a little bit of time left, and we'll resume at the top on Wednesday to finish whatever notes are left over. But one more case. Say that God, you believe in God, but there was no God. So it's not a win. You know, it's choosing one stance, but that's not the reality. Nonetheless, what is lost, if anything, when a person believes, but let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that there was no God? What would really be lost? Some people say nothing at all. And, you know, that makes sense. You might say, well, there's no punishment, no like reward is denied, and just there's no God. So nothing is lost. But maybe it's like a little loss of some amount of time and energy that you spend like practicing religion and maintaining your faith and all of that. At the same time, some people wouldn't even count that as a loss, because you might think that the time and energy that you spend reading scriptures, going to church, you know, being in the community is a joyful thing. So it's either no loss or a small loss, okay, if you're wrong. Let's take the other side of the coin, as it were. Now, so suppose someone doesn't believe in God, but God really did exist. So that's not a win, but this is a big loss, because what if you lost? Well, at a minimum, you're not going to heaven if that's the case. God would not reward the person according to what most think about the nature of the afterlife. And even more harsh, perhaps God would send the person to hell if that was the case. And as you guys know, hell is described as infinite pain and torture, you know, fire and brimstone, gnashing of teeth, and all those things in the scriptures and the various world religions. So that's negative to infinity. It's either the loss of the infinite happy afterlife or eternal punishment in hell. Either way, it's a negative to infinity. Suppose, though, that someone didn't believe in God and they were right. So that's like, I guess you could say, a win, like they thought there wasn't a God and there really wasn't. What did that person gain? Well, nothing really. Or you could say maybe they get back the time and energy that these folks, I guess in this case, wasted on a futile belief system, if that was the case. But that's not a huge benefit anyway. So we're going to add a few last points to this when we resume on Wednesday. But just now, I hope it's kind of coming into focus for you guys. Looking at this diagram, why do you think the author is arguing that it is just a better bet for you, as it were, to believe in God? Well, because if you believe in God and you win everything. And if you lose nothing. So it's all upside against no real downside, even if you lose. And if you didn't believe in God, then even if you're right, you really get nothing. And if you lose everything. So here, losing, you lose everything. Winning, you win nothing. Here, winning, you win everything. Losing, you lose nothing. So it's like, why would you take the risk and the chance on not believing in God? Wouldn't it just be safer or something to believe in God? And even if you're wrong, no big deal. But if you're right, you might go to heaven. You don't want to be wrong in case you take the other bet. So it seems like it's exposing you to a way more risk and possible loss. It is, Patrick, kind of like just in case. It's like believing God as insurance against the possibility of being delivered to hell in case there really is a God and he's vengeful and wrathful against those that don't avow a belief in him. So this is kind of one that's trying to motivate your belief out of almost a sense of rational self-interest or fear of reprisal or punishment in case God, does dispense with the souls in the afterlife by sending those that don't believe to hell and rewarding those that do believe with heaven. So Pascal's wager is not trying to prove that God exists. He says, to the contrary, I couldn't, and neither could anyone else. But just you have to wager on it, and you really want to take a chance of facing God's punishment if you didn't believe and he ended up being real. So, I mean, that's another way of looking at an attempt to not prove so much that God exists, but to convince you to believe in it anyway, even if you can't prove it. So, guys, just thanks again so much for all your help in getting through today's meeting. I guess have a great rest of your day. I know it's a few minutes over time, so get to your next class if you have one. Thanks again, everyone. And as I said, if you need anything, just email me and I'll be in touch. But for now, I'm going to sign off. So take it easy and have a great day. I'll see you on Wednesday. Thanks again.